Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 296 for the 18th of Elul in a leap year. So the 18th of Elul, otherwise known as Chai Elul, is a very big day in the Hasidic world, especially in the Chabad Hasidic world, because this is the birthday of both the Baal Shem Tov, who is the founder of the general Hasidic movement, as well as the Alter Rebbe, otherwise known as Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement, and also the author of the Tanya, the very Sefer, the book that is the subject of this podcast. So very cool. And I think it's really apt that the subject matter of the Tanya today, I think, really fits with both of these characters a lot, as we'll see, because the subject of today's episode is going to be all about the makeup of the divine soul. So if you've been following along these podcasts for a while, you'll recall in the very beginning of the Tanya in Sefer Shel Beinanim, we talked about this idea that a Jew doesn't just have one soul, but we actually have two souls. We have what's known as an animal soul, and then we have a godly soul, a divine soul. Now, when we first hear the word animal soul, that might sound very nasty, not so nice kind of thing. But we've actually learned that the animal soul is not that bad. And it can actually be capable of a lot of good. And kind of a better way to understand the animal soul is to think of it as the human soul, as the ego, as the part of ourselves that is out there for our own pleasure, for our own happiness, for our own comfort, just like an animal. An animal seeks all these things. So animals we see also are not necessarily always going around killing one another. They're often very loving, very giving creatures, but it's coming from a place of ego. It's coming from a place of self because it feels good to them. So that's really what the animal soul is all about. The divine soul, on the other hand, is the part of us that's an actual part of God. And being that it's seeing as it's an actual part of God, what that means is that its whole entire desire is just to cleave to God. It's selfless. It doesn't have its own needs, its own desires, and that kind of thing. And throughout our lives, as we've learned, there's this constant struggle between these two things. They're constantly at war, because what the animal soul wants is not necessarily what the godly soul wants. Like, your ego might not necessarily want what God wants of you, what's ultimately for your own good. An example that comes to mind for me for this is, let's say you have a big day ahead of you. There's a lot you got to do, a lot of mitzvahs you got to accomplish, and you also have to go to work. You have to daven. You have all these things, and you wake up in the morning. Your alarm clock wakes you up at 6 o'clock in the morning. The animal soul wants you to keep sleeping. You want to keep sleeping, and it's so comfortable in your bed. You tell yourself, sleep is really good for your body. It's really rejuvenating, and it's just so comfortable. It's so nice there. Everything. Maybe what will get you up is you smell coffee, and that coffee is going to make you a little bit more excited to get up. Those are all animal soul functions. The godly soul part of you, when that alarm clock goes off, is going to be so excited to get out of bed, to start davening, to start praying to God, to start on your day, thinking about all the things that you need to accomplish that will bring godliness here into this world, all the mitzvahs you can do today. It's a really exciting thing. It doesn't care about the coffee. It doesn't care about the comfort of the bed, that kind of thing. Now, the interesting thing is that whereas for most of us, we have this internal struggle going on between these two things, there are certain people, as we've learned, otherwise known as tzaddikim, such as the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, which is why I'm I think it's a good parallel here, who they don't have this conflict. They're not at war in this way, where the animal soul is totally subjugated to the divine soul, whether it's just sleeping and it's dormant and it's not there anymore, or in the case of very great tzaddikim, which both the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe were, like kind of like the ultimate tzaddikim, where they actually have succeeded in transforming their animal souls to the point that the animal soul does have desires, does have cravings, does have passions, but those desires and cravings and passions are the same as that divine soul. So in the case of a tzaddik like that, they will wake up in the morning and their physical body will want to wake up in the morning. It won't just be like a spiritual feeling. It actually will be a physical sensation that it will feel good to them to get out of bed in that way. Maybe they'll still want that coffee because they want to say that bracha on the coffee. They want to say a blessing on the coffee and elevate the coffee beans. And their physical body gets excited about praying to God, gets excited about doing all these mitzvahs. So there's a synchronicity between the divine soul and the animal soul. So this level of synchronicity, this level of becoming a tzaddik, we've learned already is not necessarily accessible to everybody. The most that most of us can do is really to become aware of these two forces within us and to try to just overcome the animal soul as best possible and not let it take over as best possible. And we've learned about how the struggle itself is really essential, and that's kind of the whole point. Even if we don't always win the war, if we're fighting the war, that's really what it's all about. And so that's kind of like just like a nice review to give you guys just context for what it is that we're going to be learning about today. So coming into today's episode, the focus of today's episode is, as I mentioned, going to be giving us an outline of the divine soul. And the way that we're going to examine this, the outline of the divine soul, is by actually looking back at the past couple of episodes where we looked at the topography of emotions, we called it. We looked at the makeup of the human being in a general sense. So we didn't mention it at the time, but when we were talking about the past 2 episodes ago and yesterday's episode as well, we were talking about the fact that there are different personality type systems and how all different personality type systems are all really trying to get to the root, like core building blocks of the human being, personality wise, emotion wise, all of those things. And we talked about how Torah has a perspective on this as well. Tanya, Chassidus, Kabbalah, all of that. And we gave the Torah perspective on that, the different midos, the different attributes that make up human emotion. And so what we didn't mention then, but we're going to mention it today, is that all of that stuff, we want to put it into the broader like context of Hasidic terminology. All of those emotions that we learned about are all emotions of the animal soul, or also sometimes called the nefesh hasichlis, the intellectual soul, the human soul, in other words. But what we'll learn about today is that, as mentioned, we have another soul. We have a divine soul. And not only do we have a divine soul, but actually all of these emotions that we learned about in terms of the intellectual soul, the human soul, the animal soul, are actually only there to serve as a metaphor for these deeper and more like essential emotions that we have as Jews within our divine soul. So they're kind of there to teach us how to serve God in different ways on an interesting level. So like, what do we mean by this? So for example, we talked about how there's external emotions, and then we talked about how there's internal emotions. The external emotions are chesed, giving, gvura, restraint, rachamim, compassion, etc. And there's a whole bunch of them that we talked about. But then we talked about how there's these internal emotions of love and fear, and how those are kind of like the essential emotions that are like the forefront. They're the origin of all other human emotions. Like if we think about emotions and we think about our emotions in terms of somebody relating to somebody who's close to us. So we talked about like a father with a son, for example. So how does the father express his love towards his son? Is he might hug him, he might give him presents, he might teach him things like that, right? And then on the other hand, towards the same son, the father might have a certain sense of fear. What does that mean, being fear? It's not that he's scared of his child, but he's scared for him. He wants to protect him. And in that sense, he's going to shield him from certain things that he doesn't want his son to know, or that he doesn't want his son to be, to come into contact with. Like he might put like plastic covers over the plugs around the house if the child is young enough so as not to hurt him and that kind of thing, right? So what we'll learn about today is that all of these emotions, with again love and fear being like the primary ones of all of them, are really just mirrors, really just windows into understanding our divine self, the emotions of our divine self, which is ultimately there to serve God. It's all about how to serve God, and we serve God through these different emotions. So we're going to go back to these emotions. So it's a good opportunity to review what these emotions are, and we're going to understand them from a deeper and higher perspective this time, looking at them not just in terms of human activities and things that are fulfilling towards ourselves, but actually in terms of how they can be utilized in the service of God and how they are utilized in the service of God in the case of the divine soul. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. And for context, we're going to be concluding Epistle 15 today of Iggeres HaKodesh. So here we go. So the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that all of this, meaning everything we've learned so far about this map of the emotions, and we also got into the intellect a little bit. Yesterday was focused on the intellect. All of this is just to be understood by way of analogy. Why? Because this is all within the rational soul, the intellectual soul, the nefesh sichlis, it's called in Hebrew. And this is the lower soul within a person that comes from the place of klipas noga. So klipas noga, again, just brief review. We've talked about klipas noga quite a bit here, but klipas noga is a husk. It's a translucent husk. It's like kind of like the literal translation of it. But the idea is that there are certain things in the world that God set up that conceal him for all kinds of different purposes. And those are what are known as klipos. Those are known as husks, just like a husk, like a shell of a fruit or of a nut or something like that. And some of those klipos are totally opaque, like they are just they're incapable of radiating godliness, at least at this time. But then there are some husks that are translucent. These are what are known as klipas noga. These are things in the world that we can think of as being like more kind of neutral territory. They don't embody godliness and holiness like in their own right, just in kind of like a natural way. They're there and they're kind of waiting for us to uncover and unlock the godliness that's inherent within them. So these would constitute all of the different objects in the world, all the different types of food and things like that are kosher, that are there, that we can use for mitzvahs, but that are not like things we have to use for mitzvahs, like not like a Sefer Torah or something like that. You know, it would be more like an animal who has skin that we can turn into leather to turn into a Sefer Torah would be an example of a klipas noga. So anyway, so another example of a klipas noga is the nefesh sichlis, the intellectual rational soul, right? Because this is the part of the soul, this is the part of a person, again, that could be used for godly purposes, but could also not be used for godly purposes. So it's sort of like neutral territory. But the truth is, continues the Alter Rebbe, the higher soul, so we have that lower soul and then we have the higher soul. The higher soul, which is the godly soul, is an actual part of God. In Hebrew, it's chelek elokam imal. It's an actual part of God. And so all of the attributes that we talked about, all of these emotive attributes, whether we're talking about the internal attributes or the external attributes within the divine soul, they're all for God. They're all for the sake of God. Their entire direction is towards God. So how can we understand this? So basically, because the divine soul, it loves God so much, its whole entire focus is on God. So out of its great love for God and out of its great desire to cleave to God, because it recognizes that its source is in God and it wants to really just cleave to its source, then it will want to do chesed. It will want to do goodness in order to cleave to God's attributes. So ultimately, so just kind of like to explain that. So ultimately, all of these attributes that we've been talking about are really ultimately analogies for God. Remember, we talked about a few episodes ago about how we can come to understand God through looking at man. So all of these attributes that we're talking about are really just mirror images to God, to the ultimate attributes above, which are godly. So for the divine soul wants to cleave to God. The divine soul wants to attach to God, wants to become nullified with God, wants to really just put all of their energies towards God. So how are they going to do that? So they're going to recognize the fact that chesed is a very godly trait. It's a very godly quality. It's kind of like the quintessential godly trait, at least in terms of how we relate to God. So this is going to motivate the godly soul within a person to want to do chesed, want to do kindness, because they're going to want to emulate God. And they recognize that by emulating God, this is a way that they can actually come to cleave to God. As the sages taught, and this is a citation from Devarim, chapter 11, verse 22, "Uledavka vo," and to cleave to him. And how do we, and the way that what the sages taught, what this means, how do we cleave to God is cleaving to his attributes. So it's like if we want to be close to God, then we emulate him. We emulate his attributes. So so that's the attribute of chesed, right? And that's, if you remember, in the topography of the emotions, that's on the top right side, in the like the right corner, kind of at the top, and it's the first emotion that we spoke about. Then we have the attribute of gvura. That's the second one. Gvura is this idea of might, of restraint, of judgment, of harshness. There's a harshness there. So could this be connected to the divine soul? The divine soul is supposed to be like all about light and all of that, right? So where can we see this harshness? Where can we see this restraining energy within the divine soul? So this becomes manifest in the divine soul, punishing and chastising wicked people with the punishments of the Torah. So we know that the Torah does, it's not so politically correct to talk about, but there are punishments that are outlined in the Torah. And so these things should be enforced. Right now, we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, so it's not super practical, but still there should be, like, we shouldn't just be overly accepting of everything. There is room for judgment within the godly soul, is the point. And also, not only is there room for judgment on the outside, but also within the person to be able to overcome over their evil inclination and to sanctify themselves with that which is permitted to them. So, right? So we spoke about just before this battle, this internal battle that we have going on between the divine soul and the God and the animal soul. And so the attribute of gvura within the divine soul is what allows a person to overcome their animal soul and to hold them back from doing anything that's against the will of God, and not only doing something that's against the will of God, but actually to keep themselves refined even in the realm of doing the world of God. So that would mean that, let's say you're eating a meal and the meal is totally 100% kosher. You said a bracha on the food, so no problem. You can eat the whole thing if you want to. But are you going to eat that meal like a glutton? Are you going to eat past the point of satiation? Or will you eat it with a divine awareness? Will you eat it in a more sanctified way? Will you stop maybe when you're not hungry anymore? These are things that are the gvura attribute of your divine soul is going to help you in doing this. And also, what's another thing that the gvura aspect of the divine soul can do? It can set up a barrier and a fence around the Torah. So these are things that this comes up, in a lot of different ways, that it's sort of like we have the letter of the law of the Torah, and then there's like this idea of like, okay, there's certain things that we're technically permitted to do, but it might be a good idea to kind of like, set up a fence for yourself. So not to put yourself in a situation that might become more tempting to you to sin. Right. So for each person, this is going to be something else. So if you know, for example, that there's like a certain like environment, that if you go into that environment, certain friends of yours that you have maybe even, or certain music that you listen to, or certain movies that you might watch or something like that, that might lead you towards a path of, God forbid, falling and not being as connected to God as you could be, then that would be another way that the gvura within your divine soul would manifest, would be to set up these boundaries for yourself, to say, you know what, I know I'm technically allowed to watch that movie, I'm technically allowed to go to that place, listen to that music or whatever, but I'm gonna set up these boundaries. And some of these boundaries were actually set up by the sages themselves, because they knew about human nature, in order to prevent yourself from being put in a situation that might be too tempting for you. And this all comes from a place of fearing God and having awe of God, and fearing getting into a place of sin. So it's like, for the divine soul, the most fearful, the most traumatic type of thing that could happen to them is, God forbid, sinning. So they want to do anything they can to prevent themselves from sinning. So just like when we talked about the attribute of gvura with the father and the son, that the father fears for the son, the father fears that their son is going to touch the electrical outlet, or is going to be exposed to things that will be harmful for him, things like that. So he's going to prevent him from doing anything like that or being exposed to those kind of things. So to here, it's like in the case of the divine soul, the biggest fear of the divine soul is for the divine soul to be disconnected from God in the form of sinning, God forbid. So that is going to prevent a person from getting anywhere near sin at all. Okay, now we did the first two attributes, the attribute of chesed, and we did gvura on the left upper corner. Now we have the attribute of tiferet, the attribute of rachamim, of glory. Right? That's the third one, the beauty, sometimes it's called. So what does that mean? How does that translate into the divine soul? This is beautifying God and beautifying his Torah with all kinds of different gloriful ways. So it's like if you might buy a really, really nice siddur, a really nice Sefer Torah, you might sing a really nice song on Shabbos to go together with different brachas you do, Birkat Hamazon, things like that. You buy really beautiful clothes for Shabbos or Yom Tov. You make yourself look beautiful for the sake of the Shabbos or the sake of the Yom Tov. So all of this is in order, again, to cleave to God through his praises and with all the aspects, all the faculties of a person's soul. So God's praises are also an aspect of the beautifying of God. We talk about God and all his glory and all praising God in all these ways. So when a person really focuses their mind and their thoughts and also their speech on these things of praising God, this is another way that they can tap into this attribute of the tiferet, of the glorification, the beauty of the divine soul. Okay, then what do we have right after that? Then we have the aspect of the nitzachon, the netzach one, right? That's the one that's lower on the right-hand side of on the right-hand side, that's lower down below Tiferet. So what does that translate into? So netzach, again, is endurance. It's also translated as winning, as victory. So it's being victorious against anything that holds a person back from serving God and from cleaving to God. So this is what's going to make a person really be like strong and not give up in spite of any kind of outside pressures for anything. So this reminds me of people who in the past, they went to such great lengths, our ancestors went to such great lengths just to toivel in a mikveh, or just to, in the Holocaust, Jews, they went to such great lengths to find matzah and Pesach, to find a menorah, something that they could do. This is the netzach. This is the part of them that is going to make you prevail. That's going to make you really push forward to keep these mitzvahs, to do the mitzvahs no matter what, and against anything that might be restraining you. And this could be something, and nowadays you can think about this. Let's say you're in a situation and it's really difficult for you to find a minyan, but you really want to find a minyan to daven with. If you're a man, you're going to really go at great lengths. You're not going to just look in one or two places. You're going to look around until you can find that minyan. For a woman, that could be something like you want to find nice tznius clothing, and you find some clothing and it's kind of tznius, but not 100% tznius or whatever. And you're like, it might be good enough. No, the netzach part of you is going to be persistent and keep enduring and keep looking for those clothing, for that good clothing that's going to help you manifest your being in a godly and divine way. And not only will this netzach give you this endurance to be able to serve God and go against and push away anything that is against the service of God, but it's actually going to push away anything that is deterring the glory of God to fill the entire world. So this power of endurance within the divine soul, the godly soul, is really there to really just push away anything that is preventing God manifesting here in this world. So it's like we can liken it, says the Alter Rebbe, to the wars of God that David HaMelech, that King David fought for the sake of God. Like the wars that King David fought for the sake of God, those were coming from a place of netzach. And so too, when we bow down to God and when we praise God, this is also coming from the divine soul. So this is now, the Alter Rebbe has actually moved on to the next attribute. This is the attribute of hod, the attribute of humility. So this is where we make ourselves humble before God, and we recognize the fact that God vivifies and brings into being everything, and that everything is nullified in existence before him, and everything exists as if naught and like nothingness before him. And even though this isn't something that we can truly understand, that everything is like nothingness before God, like it's something we say, but do we really understand it? Nevertheless, we admit this and we acknowledge it with a true acknowledgement, a true humility, that this is a true truth. And included in this is the idea of praising God for and offering thanks for all of God's midos, all of God's attributes, and all of God's action in all of the worlds, whether it's the world of Atsilis and in the creation of the higher worlds and the lower worlds, to recognize that they are praiseworthy to no end. So in another nosach, in another rendition of this book, it's praiseworthy to no understanding, beyond our understanding. So it's like sort of like this like humble appreciation and acknowledgement of God. And we realize that these praises are very fitting to God, and that who's so blessed and so exalted. And this is the phraseology that corresponds to this. This comes from Tehillim chapter 104 verse 1, Hod v'adar, majesty and splendor. So there's this like splendor aspect of it. And so this is all coming from that attribute of Hod within the divine soul. So Hod, again, is like the left side on the bottom underneath. So we likened the Netzach and Hod to the testicle. So I guess it would be the left testicle. Now we're coming to the next one, the Yesod. Yesod is the one that's underneath Netzach and Hod, the one that is in the middle beneath that. So for the attribute of Yesod, the Alter Rebbe brings the citation from Mishlei chapter 10 verse 25, where it says Tzaddik Yesod Olam. The Tzaddik is the foundation of the world. So there's the Tzaddik is often likened to the attribute of Yesod. So why? Because the tzaddik, his soul is connected to God, the life of all life, and to cleave to God and his whole cleaving of God. The tzaddik is all about cleaving to God and yearning for God with a great yearning and a great pleasure. So this is the idea of Yesod. So Yesod is kind of like the pinnacle. So again, if we're talking about this idea of the divine soul, and we're talking about how the divine soul is really all about the tzaddik, because the tzaddik is the one who embodies the divine soul fully and completely. So the Yesod is very much tied to the tzaddik, because Yesod is all about connection. It's all about really fusing with the other outside of the self. And there's an aspect of longing, of yearning with that. So we liken this in the episode where we talked about these emotions in more human terms to the father who wants to give over the knowledge to his son. So it's not just about him knowing a lot and knowing how to give over the knowledge. You need to have that passion there, that passion and that yearning, that desire for his son to know. That's what's going to motivate him. That's what's going to infuse the knowledge and make it palatable, make it connect with the son, make the son internalize it. We also likened it to the act of intimacy, that there's something sexual about the Yesod. It's often associated with sexuality, with intimacy, and the idea there is that for the male, in order to connect with the female in an intimate way, there needs to be a desire there. There needs to be, it's not just a physical thing, but it's actually, there's something very passionate happening on a deeper level. So that's the idea of the Yesod here. So now we're coming to Malchus. So interestingly, I think this is fascinating that when we talked about the human emotions, if you recall, we actually left out the attribute of Malchus. We didn't talk about it, and the Alter Rebbe didn't give an explanation for this as to why it was left out. If any of the listeners happen to know why, if you know why this is, then I'd love to hear about that. Maybe you can leave it in the comments in YouTube and write something about that there, because I think that's really interesting, especially in light of the fact that here, when it comes to the divine soul, the Alter Rebbe actually does bring up the attribute of Malchus. And so he talks about that in the divine soul, what is this attribute of Malchus? This is the Malchus is kingship, sovereignty. So this is accepting upon a person the yoke of the kingship of heaven. So, and the service of God, like the service of a servant to his master with great fear. So it's like an acknowledgement of God being our king. It's an acknowledgement of the fact that God is our sovereign king, and I'm going to serve him just like a servant would serve his master. Okay, so those are the 7 godly attributes as they're manifest in the divine soul. So just like when we spoke about the human attributes, the human emotions, we talked about how their source was in the intellect, within the intellectual faculties. So here too, there's a similar thing that the godly attributes they're rooted in the intellectual attributes. So how is this? How is it that the intellectual attributes are the root of these emotive attributes? Okay, so for example, so we have chokhmah, right? So chokhmah is the first intellectual attribute, again, translated as wisdom, really better understood as kind of like intuition. It's that space that precedes the intellectual understanding, the more like elucidated understanding. So in terms of God, because again, the divine soul is all about God. So it's the source of the part of the intellect that comes to understand God and understands God's wisdom and God's greatness and God's attributes, God's holy attributes that conduct and animate all of the worlds, the higher worlds and the lower worlds. So basically, the chokhmah is this part of the divine soul that is like this like intuitive space that comes right before a person actually sits down and meditates and thinks about God in a more logical, rational, and conscious kind of way. And then the bina, that's the part that's where there's the actual meditation and contemplation upon God on all kinds of different dimensions. So in Chassidus, they talk about this in terms of length, in terms of width, and in terms of depth. So this is there's a lot to explore there, but the basic idea is that when a person in their minds, they think about God in all of these different ways in a long way, like in terms of what that briefly means is how to apply this knowledge in many different ways. The wide way is just like all the different aspects of the knowledge, and then in a deep way, meaning like really what is this knowledge essentially all about. So to be able to understand one thing for another, like to really be able to grasp things in a way that it's not like just the knowledge superficially, but you really know it and you can like make deductions out of it. So that's the idea of bina. And that not only that, but this true bina, that when a person has this level of bina on a true level, when the person truly understands something, what's the sign of true understanding? That this can lead to emotion. It's not going to just stay in the intellect. If a person's understands something, like sometimes when we've spoken about these intellectuals who are just like very, very high up there in their mind, and they seem to have a very deep grasp and understanding of things intellectually, but they're very cut off from their emotions, and it doesn't translate into their emotions. Like let's say if you have somebody who is like an expert in nutrition and in health and things like that, you see this a lot of times with doctors who are often very obese, and they're sitting and they're lecturing their patients on good health and diabetes and high cholesterol and stuff like that. And they themselves, obviously, it didn't translate into their own self. So what the Alter Rebbe is teaching us here is that means there's something lacking in their understanding. Good understanding, the fullest, utmost understanding will translate into feelings. It's not going to just stay in the mind. It's going to translate into feelings, specifically the feelings of love and fear, and all of the other emotions. That here we're talking about the emotions specifically of the godly soul, because in this case we're talking about the divine soul, the godly soul, coming to try to understand and think about and contemplate the greatness of God, and God's greatness is unfathomable. As the Alter Rebbe says, this is a citation from Tehillim, chapter 145, verse 3. His greatness is unfathomable. And now the Alter Rebbe kind of like walks us through how it is exactly that this meditation can lead to emotions of love and fear. Like, why does that happen? So the Alter Rebbe says that there's in an aspect of, let's say a person's taking the time to meditate and learn about God. So the aspect of learning about the greatness of God, the more the godly soul, the divine soul, meditates upon this, then a great fear and dread is going to come upon them. So it's kind of like the more you spend the time actually thinking and studying different things, it's going to translate. It's most likely going to translate into having some kind of emotional effect on you. So, I mean, that it would be hard to imagine that obese doctor sitting there. I mean, it would be one thing for him to be lecturing his clients about the art of eating well and all those things, and him kind of not following the same message. But like most likely, like it would be harder to imagine him sitting there eating a donut while he's actually sitting and thinking about and learning nutritional facts, right? I mean, it could happen, but it's not necessarily as likely. So here too, it's like a way that that these emotions of fear and dread of going against God's will can be birthed is through taking the time to actually sit and think about God and the greatness of God. And this is what's known as being the lower aspect of fear. So fear has a lower aspect, and then fear has a higher aspect to it as well. And so this lower aspect of fear is the aspect of malchus. This also falls into the category of malchus, of sovereignty. This is like where you're scared of the king. You don't want to go against the will of the king. And then there is another part of the learning about the greatness of God that brings about this higher type of fear, which is, what's the higher fear? It's not fear of punishment necessarily and just like being scared, like, in that kind of simple way, but it's actually a bashfulness. It's like embarrassment. So it's a little bit more refined than that. And then there's another way of contemplating and meditating upon the greatness of God that can also bring about a great love for God, known as Ava Rabba, a very great love of God. And then there's another way a person can meditate upon God's greatness that can bring about a smaller love of God, the Ava Zuta, it's called. And so this is all about how like this meditation can bring about these different internal feelings of love and fear, which, remember, we talked about those are like the internal feelings. Then we have the external feelings, the external attributes, which is chesed, gvura, tiferet, all those, right? And these also come about through the intellect. They're sourced in the intellect. And with all of these, says the Alter Rebbe, there needs to be vested within them the aspect of das. So das is a very, very interesting thing. It's like, that could be a lecture or many lectures in its own right, what das is all about. We've spoken about das previously quite a bit. It's the idea, often it's the third intellectual attribute. There's chokhmah, bina, and das. Dat in Hebrew, in like Israeli type of, or Sephardi Hebrew, it's literally translated to mean knowledge or opinion, but it actually connotes a lot more than that. It's the idea of connection. It's the idea of attachment. It's when things become personal, when you would have that doctor in the room who's giving you knowledge and advice about nutrition, and he is keeping his own advice because he really feels it, and he's not just saying the words on an intellectual place. They're not just staying in his brain, but it actually does translate into his self. It is very personal. And so here the Alter Rebbe says this is the idea of where there's that connection of the soul that is to the understanding. So it's not just like a kind of cold understanding that a person understands something about the greatness of God, but it's actually going to connect to the soul. And from this is what's going to birth all these different emotions, so that there's going to be an emotional component to it as well in the divine soul. Because if a person even momentarily switches their minds, like shifts their attention to something else from this understanding that they're thinking about, then this emotion that they feel will also go away from being revealed, and it's going to become concealed once again. And it's going to be there in potential, but not in actuality. So like we've often had this experience in our lives, right? That like when you're focusing on your attention on one thing and you're feeling a certain way about that one thing, but then like something happens and something distracts you and your emotions follow that distraction as well. Right? So attention is a very, very powerful tool. We had a whole episode a while back where we talked about this experiment that was actually done on me at McGill University, where they showed us a film of these people throwing a basketball back and forth to each other, and there was a gorilla that walked right through, and most of the 800 students in the class, including me, did not notice the gorilla, or rather it was a man in a gorilla suit walking through. And that's because our attention was not placed on the gorilla. We were focusing on the ball going back and forth. So attention really does drive us. It drives where we are, not just intellectually, but emotionally as well. Those who saw the man in the gorilla suit, they were laughing. They were feeling a sense of humor that we were not feeling. We weren't feeling that emotion because we didn't see that, So das is this very essential thing that's all about connection. So now the Alter Rebbe goes on and he explains that this is why the act of intimacy, of sexual intimacy, is actually called das. So the most famous example of this is when we look in the Bible in the story of Bereshis with Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, where it says Adam yada et Chava, Adam knew Eve. This is a euphemism for explaining their physical intimacy that they had with one another. And so why is it? Why is knowledge, das, associated with this act of physical intimacy? Because it's this idea of connection, this merging idea. And so now, interestingly, there are different levels of das. So there's something known as a lower das tachton, it's called. And this is das that becomes manifest, like extends into the emotive attributes and becomes vested within them to vivify them and to bring them, to keep them in existence. So this is the das that basically, it's to explain this on a kind of Kabbalistic level. This is the das that comes, so you have like Chochma, Bina, Das, and then that das afterwards, that connects to the emotions below, the Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus. But then we have a higher das. There's a supernal das. What's that supernal das? This is the idea of the connection within the intellect itself, to be able to understand the depth of the intellect. And this is likened to a bolt of lightning that comes and like shines within a person's mind, so that it will come down below, so that this part of this depth of the understanding will come into comprehension with it in a wide way, and to be able to explain it with great length and in great width, which is the aspect of Bina, which is called the Rechovot HaNahar. This is called the expanses of the river, as will be explained in its place. So just to explain that, I kind of rushed through that a little bit. So the lower das is the das that connects the intellect with emotions below it, and the higher das is actually what connects Chochma with Bina. So that's where we have this intuitive sense of something that we can't quite grasp, but we know that it's true. We know that it's there, and we can't really put it into words. And then somehow we're able to translate it into words. We're able to come to this place of understanding. So it actually connects the Chochma with the Bina itself. There's actually an even higher form of Das Elyon, but we're not going to get into that today, where it actually connects the Chochma with with this Koach HaMaskil, which is like even above that, the power to be able to, of the intellect in that way. But suffice it to say, the main point of all of this is just to really emphasize how important this Das trait is, this power of connection, of attachment, in terms of birthing all of these emotions that come about through intellect, and even to get the intellectual juices flowing, to get that stuff to happen by connecting the Chochma with the Bina. So that's the end of the section today. So now we have a really thorough map, hopefully, of all of our emotions, all of our intellectual faculties, both on a human level in terms of our rational or animal soul, and also on a more divine, higher level, and which is really ultimately the true emotions. So the next time, so maybe to translate this into practicality, the next time you have a feeling, you feel something, whatever that feeling is, take a moment and see if you can try to recognize what the feeling is. See if you can try to map it onto that topography of emotions that we talked about. And then see if you can think about how it might be serving as a metaphor for your service of God in some way. So the next time you walk into a room and you see a bunch of strangers, you've never seen them before. Let's say it's a party that you've been invited to and you don't really know anybody there, and you feel a sense of embarrassment or shame or fear in front of all these people. So first of all, recognize the fact that this is fear. This is the emotion of yira. And secondly, to recognize that this is just really here to teach you a lesson. This sense of fear is, you shouldn't be having fear of other people, of shame in front of other people, but it's really there to teach you that your deepest self has the sense of fear and shame before God. So that's what it's really truly all about, right? Maybe another thing that comes to mind is, let's say you have a craving for a certain type of food, and you've had a long day at work and you just want to treat yourself. You just want to, give yourself a present, feed yourself in some way. So you eat a cookie. So that's coming from a place of chesed within you. You want to do good for yourself, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We want to treat ourselves sometimes. So maybe you could say a higher level of that would be treating somebody else well, acting nice to somebody else. Maybe not. Sometimes it's good to treat ourselves as well, good if we need to nourish ourselves to be healthy. But you can also think about it in the sense that, wow, why do I have this desire to do good to myself or to others? And all of that is because ultimately my godly soul wants to do good. My godly soul wants to emulate God, who is all about doing goodness and kindness and chesed. So it can give you kind of like a little window into appreciating this deeper and more divine part of yourself. So that's it for today, and stay tuned tomorrow when we begin a new epistle, Epistle 16, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.